latest live in the Iraqi capital. Well, let's stay with the story. We're joined now by Zeidon Alkinani, Middle East analyst and contributor to Open Democracy, and he's joining us live from here in Doha. Very good to have you with us on Aljazeera. So as we've been hearing from our correspondent and the Iraqi government, they say that there were no live fire was used in these protests, and yet 42 people have been killed, thousands injured. So just how dangerous a situation are we in now? Because again, to remind our viewers, these are a continuation of the protest that started on the 1st of October, and before this Friday, 149 people have already been killed.
Well, these protests and the violent crackdown that has been met by these protests are just another evidence why the Iraqi people shouldn't believe the economic reforms that the Iraqi Prime Minister is promising them. He broke the promise that he would allow them to have their democratic and their constitutional right for freedom of expression, to protest on the streets, for better public services, better human rights, better social services, better education, better employability rates. However, it was met by violent crackdown.
Mr. Alkinani, on that point though, there were reports yesterday that some protesters were breaking into government buildings and setting them on fire. So how is the government supposed to respond when protests do take that kind of a violent turn?
Yeah, well, the violence issue in the Iraqi protests, especially this month, is a very tricky one. We have to question the violence that comes from the governmental side before we question the violence coming from the protesters. We have covered militias attacking and sniping people from across the buildings, on top of the rooftops of buildings, towards the protesters, whilst the government is not doing anything about it. So I think we should question the violence coming from the governmental side before we question the burning of buildings coming from the protesters, whom are not even using any sort of self-defense. And if there is any violence that happened in the governorate of the Maysan in southern Iraq, according to many people on the ground, that was a direct clash between Saraya Salam, which is the armed wing of Muqtada al-Sadr's political movement, who is a part of the government, against Asa'ib al-Haq, which is another Shia militia that formerly used to be a part of the Mahdi army, the former name of Saraya Salam during the sectarian war in 2006 and 8.
And you're spelling out, just some of the reasons why the protests are, as you yourself say, and the violence are complicated, because there's the protesters, there is the violence that we have seen from the government side. It's been called disproportionate by international organizations, a number of people killed. But then there's also the snipers that are reported to have been put there by the Iranian-backed Popular Mobilization Forces.
We have to be careful when we use the term Iranian-backed Popular Mobilization Forces. The Popular PMUs is an umbrella organization that consists of very different armed groups. Some of them are loyal to the Iraqi government, some of them are loyal to the Iranian government or the Iranian supreme leader, and some of them are loyal towards the religious establishment in Iraq. The PMUs, the Iranian militias within the PMUs are the ones who are involved in those protests and are arguably the ones who are attacking those protesters on behalf of the Adil Abdel Mahdi's government.
Again, while that is a mixed picture, what would you say about the number of Iraqis that we've seen out on the streets, especially yesterday, calling for the end of calling for the end of, whether it's Iranian or US, external influence in Iraqi politics?
Of course, the main factor that motivates us to believe that this is the most effective anti-Iran sentiment that has ever happened since post-2003 Iraq is that most of these uprisings or most of these protests are happening in the southern of Iraq, which is a Shia majority region of Iraq, and that was always the argument of the Iranian influence in Iraq, that they are in the Iraqi arena to protect their Shia partners, and similarly to regional power players across the other part of the borders of Iraq, who are claiming to be defending the Kurds or the Sunnis. But the anti-Iran sentiment here is proving to be more significant than any other time in post-2003 Iraq, because it's coming from the Shia Iraqis themselves against the Iranian influence in Iraq. However, the Shia Iraqis today are not protesting as Shia Iraqis. They are protesting as Iraqis before they are protesting as Shias, just as the Sunnis hopefully would join them in the upcoming weeks as Iraqis before they are Sunnis.
There is so much to talk about on the subject, but unfortunately that is all the time we have for now. That is Zeidon Alkinani joining us live in